Elizabeth Lawson clutched her tattered wedding dress as the rain poured down, washing away the tears streaming down her face. Her wedding day, what should have been the happiest day of her life, had transformed into a nightmare, leaving her alone on the muddy streets of Austin, Texas in 1876, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The rain intensified, soaking through the delicate white fabric that just hours ago had been adorned with flowers and ribbons. Her golden hair, once perfectly arranged atop her head, now hung in wet strands around her shoulders. The thunder that rumbled overhead matched the storm in her heart as she remembered the cruel words of Harold Townsend's parents. No dowry, no family connections. Did you honestly think we would welcome a penniless orphan into our family, Mrs. Townsend had sneered after the wedding ceremony when the guests had departed and only family remained. "But Harold loves me," Elizabeth had protested weakly, looking toward her new husband for support. Harold, whom she had loved with her whole heart for the past year, had merely stared at the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze or defend her against his mother's accusations. "Harold knows what is expected of him," his father had stated coldly. "This marriage was a mistake, one we intend to rectify immediately. The paperwork for annulment will be filed tomorrow." Before she could comprehend what was happening, Elizabeth found herself pushed outside the Townsend mansion. The door slammed in her face, with only her wedding dress and a small reticule containing her meager possessions. Now, hours later, she stumbled through the streets of Austin, disoriented and heartbroken. The town had grown considerably in recent years, with the arrival of the railroad making it a bustling center of commerce. But on this rainy night, the streets were nearly deserted, shops closed and windows shuttered against the storm. Elizabeth had no money for a hotel, no family to take her in. The orphanage where she had grown up until the age of 18 had closed the previous year. Her position as a schoolteacher had been given away when she'd resigned to marry Harold. Everything she had planned for her future had vanished in a single evening. A particularly strong gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Desperate for shelter, she made her way toward an alley between two buildings, hoping to find some respite from the downpour. As she rounded the corner, she collided with something solid, a man's chest. "Whoa there, miss," a deep voice said, strong hands steadying her by the shoulders. "Are you all right?" Elizabeth looked up through the rain to see a tall man with a weather-beaten face partially obscured by the brim of his cowboy hat. In the dim light from a nearby window, she could make out concerned hazel eyes and a strong jawline shadowed with stubble. I'm sorry," she stammered, attempting to step back, but her legs buckled beneath her, exhaustion and emotion finally taking their toll. The stranger caught her before she could fall, one arm around her waist. "Easy now. You're soaked through and shivering." He glanced at her attire, his expression changing to one of confusion. "Is that a wedding dress?" The simple question broke what remained of Elizabeth's composure. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak through her sobs. The man's expression softened. "Name's Henry Tucker. I've got a room at the boarding house just up the street. Let's get you out of this rain, and you can tell me what happened if you're of a mind to." Elizabeth hesitated. Her mother had raised her with strict principles before passing away when Elizabeth was just 12, and accepting help from a strange man went against everything she'd been taught. But the alternative was spending the night in the rain, likely catching her death from cold. "I'm Elizabeth Lawson," she managed through chattering teeth. "Or I was supposed to be Elizabeth Townsend after today." "Supposed to be?" Henry questioned, but then shook his head. "Never mind that now. Questions can wait until you're warm and dry." He removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. The heavy leather was warm from his body and smelled of horses, tobacco, and something indefinably masculine. He guided her gently up the street, his strong arm supporting her as they walked. Mrs. Patterson, the stern-faced proprietress of the boarding house, looked up with surprise when they entered the small lobby. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of Elizabeth in her bedraggled wedding attire. "Mr. Tucker, you know the rules. No women visitors after 9 o'clock," she said sharply. "Mrs. Patterson, this lady needs help," Henry explained. "She's been left out in the storm with nowhere to go. Surely you can make an exception for Christian charity." The older woman's expression softened slightly as she took in Elizabeth's pitiful state. "What happened to you, child?" Elizabeth opened her mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, more tears welled in her eyes. "She's had a rough time of it," Henry answered for her. "Do you have a spare room for the night?" Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then nodded. "Room 4 is vacant, but I'll need payment in advance." Henry reached into his pocket and placed several coins on the counter without hesitation. "This should cover tonight and tomorrow." "I can't accept your charity," Elizabeth protested weakly, but Henry shook his head. "It's not charity, Miss Lawson. It's what decent folk do for one another." He turned back to Mrs. Patterson. "Could you also find some dry clothes for her? Something of your daughter's, perhaps?" Mrs. Patterson nodded, her initial sternness completely gone. "I'll bring up some hot tea and soup as well. Poor thing looks half-starved." Henry guided Elizabeth up the narrow staircase to a small but clean room with a single bed, a washstand, and a chair. A faded quilt covered the bed, and curtains framed the window that looked out over the rainy street. "I'll wait outside while Mrs. Patterson helps you get changed," he said, turning to leave. "Mr. Tucker," Elizabeth called, stopping him at the door. "Thank you. I don't know how I can repay your kindness." He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "No need for repayment, Miss Lawson. Just get yourself warm and rested. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out what comes next." After he left, Mrs. Patterson arrived with a nightgown, a simple dress, and undergarments. She helped Elizabeth out of her sodden wedding dress, clucking sympathetically at the bruises on her arms where Harold's father had gripped her while throwing her out. "That's a wedding dress, ain't it?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she hung the wet garment by the small stove to dry. Elizabeth nodded, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. "Did your husband do this to you?" the older woman asked, her voice hard with disapproval. "No, his parents," Elizabeth managed. They decided I wasn't good enough. He didn't stop them." Mrs. Patterson's lips tightened. "Some men aren't worth the ground they walk on. You're better off without a husband who won't stand up for his wife." She helped Elizabeth into the dry nightgown. "Mr. Tucker's a good man. Known him for 3 years now. He stays here whenever he's in town, usually for a few weeks at a time. Works as a ranch foreman up north during the season, but he's got business interests here in Austin." Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion washing over her. "He's been very kind." "That he has. Rest now. I'll bring up that soup." After Mrs. Patterson left, there was a gentle knock at the door. Henry's voice came through the wood. "Miss Lawson, Mrs. Patterson says you're decent. May I come in for a moment?" "Yes," Elizabeth called, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Henry entered, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of soup and a cup of tea. He set it on the small table beside the bed. "Mrs. Patterson got caught up with another boarder. She asked me to bring this up." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, the aroma of the chicken soup making her suddenly aware of her hunger. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, too nervous about the wedding to manage lunch. "If you don't mind my asking," Henry said, standing awkwardly by the door, "what happened tonight?" "You don't have to tell me if you'd rather not." Elizabeth took a sip of the hot tea, letting it warm her from the inside. I was married today, or I thought I was. Harold Townsend and I exchanged vows at the church, but afterward, his parents informed me that the marriage would be annulled immediately. Her voice trembled. They said I wasn't worthy of their son, no dowry, no connections. They threw me out with just the clothes on my back. Henry's expression darkened. The Townsends, Richard Townsend's boy, Elizabeth nodded. You know them, know of them, Henry corrected. Richard Townsend owns the largest bank in Austin, has his fingers in most business here. He's not a man who's used to being crossed. He shook his head. But to throw a woman out on the street on her wedding night, that's beyond contemptible. Elizabeth took a spoonful of soup, the warmth and flavor bringing a small measure of comfort. Harold and I met at church social events. He seemed so different from his parents, kind, gentle. I thought he loved me enough to stand up to them. Some men never learn to stand on their own, Henry said. They remain boys, doing as they're told. He moved to the door. I'll let you rest now. My room is just across the hall if you need anything. Mr. Tucker, Elizabeth called as he opened the door. What happens tomorrow? I have nowhere to go, no job, no family. Henry paused, considering her words. I have some business to attend to in the morning, but afterward we can discuss your options. Austin's growing fast. There's work for those willing to do it. We'll figure something out. After he left, Elizabeth finished her soup and tea, then slipped under the covers of the narrow bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day, the hope and happiness of the morning, the devastation of the evening. She had loved Harold truly, or at least she had thought she did. Now she wondered if she had ever really known him at all. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but for the first time since being thrown from the Townsend home, Elizabeth felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps tomorrow would bring better things. Morning arrived with clear skies and bright sunshine that streamed through the window, waking Elizabeth from a fitful sleep. For a moment, she was disoriented, not recognizing her surroundings. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and with them, a fresh wave of grief and humiliation. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson entered with a tray bearing a simple breakfast of porridge, toast, and coffee. "Good morning, dear," the older woman said, setting the tray on the table. "How are you feeling today?" "Better, thank you," Elizabeth replied, though it wasn't entirely true. Physically, she had recovered from the chill of the rain, but her heart still ached with betrayal. "Mr. Tucker left early this morning," Mrs. Patterson informed her as she opened the curtains wider to let in more light. "Said he had business at the courthouse, but he'd be back by noon. He's paid for your room for the week, so you needn't worry about that." "The week?" Elizabeth was stunned. "That's far too generous. I can't accept—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "The man can afford it, and he clearly wants to help. Sometimes pride is a luxury one can't afford, Miss Lawson." Elizabeth couldn't argue with that. She had nothing, no money, no home, no job. "Do you know if there might be any positions available for a teacher in town? That was my profession before." "Before you thought you were getting married," Mrs. Patterson finished for her. "I can't say for certain, but I do know Mrs. Whitman at the Mercantile was looking for help. It's not teaching, but it's honest work. You might inquire there after breakfast." Elizabeth nodded gratefully. "I will, and thank you for the clothes." She gestured to the simple blue dress laid out at the foot of the bed. "They belong to my daughter, Mary. She's married now and living in Dallas." Mrs. Patterson smiled sadly. "They've been sitting in a trunk, doing no one any good. They might be a bit large on you, but they'll serve until you can get something better." After breakfast, Elizabeth dressed in the borrowed clothes. The dress was indeed a bit large, but with some strategic pinning, she managed to make it presentable. She used the small mirror above the washstand to arrange her hair in a simple bun, trying to restore some semblance of dignity to her appearance. The streets of Austin were bustling with morning activity when she stepped outside. Wagons and carriages moved along the thoroughfare, and pedestrians hurried about their business. Elizabeth made her way toward the Mercantile, determined to secure employment before Henry Tucker returned. She was already too much in his debt. Whitman's Mercantile occupied a large storefront on Congress Avenue. The windows displayed an array of goods from fabrics and household items to tools and food staples. A bell jingled as Elizabeth entered the shop. Mrs. Whitman, a plump woman in her 50s with graying hair tucked neatly under a cap, looked up from her ledger. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman," Elizabeth replied. "I heard you might be looking for assistance in your shop. I'd like to apply for the position." Mrs. Whitman studied her with shrewd eyes. "You're new to town." "I've been in Austin for 2 years," Elizabeth explained. "I was a teacher at the school on Pine Street until recently." Recognition dawned in Mrs. Whitman's face. "Miss Lawson, I believe my nephew was in your class last year." "Timothy Whitman," Elizabeth smiled, remembering the bright, freckle-faced boy. "Yes, Timothy was an excellent student, very quick with numbers." "He spoke highly of you," Mrs. Whitman said, her manner warming. "Why did you leave teaching? It seemed to suit you." Elizabeth hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I had planned to marry, but circumstances changed unexpectedly." Something in her tone must have conveyed her distress, because Mrs. Whitman's expression softened with understanding. "I see. Well, I do need help, especially with inventory and accounts. Can you start today?" Relief washed over Elizabeth. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman." "The pay is $8 a week," Mrs. Whitman continued. "Hours are from 8 until 6, with Sundays off, of course." It wasn't much, but it would allow Elizabeth to support herself eventually. "That's very fair." Mrs. Whitman showed her around the store, explaining the layout and procedures. By mid-morning, Elizabeth was arranging a new shipment of fabric, carefully recording each bolt in the inventory ledger. The work was straightforward, and she found herself grateful for the distraction from her troubles. Around noon, the bell above the door jingled, and Henry Tucker walked in. He spotted Elizabeth immediately, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Lawson," he greeted her, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might be here. I see you found employment already." Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks. There was something about his direct gaze that made her feel both seen and flustered. "Yes, Mrs. Whitman has been kind enough to hire me, and I must thank you again for your generosity. Mrs. Patterson told me you paid for my room for a week." "It was the least I could do," Henry replied. He turned to Mrs. Whitman, who was watching their interaction with interest. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitman. I've come to pick up that order of leather gloves and boots I requested last month." "Of course, Mr. Tucker. They arrived just yesterday." Mrs. Whitman bustled to the back of the store. While she was gone, Henry turned back to Elizabeth. "I took the liberty of visiting the courthouse this morning," he said in a lower voice. "Wanted to see if the Townsends had filed those annulment papers." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. "And had they?" "Not yet," Henry replied, "but I reckon it's just a matter of time. I spoke with Judge Wilson. He's a fair man. He said that if you contest the annulment, there would need to be a hearing." He paused, studying her face. "Do you want to contest it? Do you want to remain married to Harold Townsend?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard. Did she? After the way Harold had failed to defend her, could she ever trust him again? I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me feels I should fight for the marriage I committed to before God. Another part knows that a marriage without love and respect is no marriage at all. Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. You don't have to decide right away, you have time. Mrs. Whitman returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. Here you are, Mr. Tucker. Will there be anything else? No, madam, that'll do. He paid for his purchase, then turned back to Elizabeth. I thought I might call for you after work. Perhaps we could have supper at the hotel restaurant to celebrate your new position. Elizabeth hesitated. Dining alone with a man she barely knew wasn't entirely proper, especially so soon after her wedding disaster. But Henry had been nothing but kind and respectful, and the thought of returning to the empty boarding-house room to dwell on her sorrows was depressing. That would be lovely, thank you, she found herself saying. Henry's smile was warm. I'll return at 6 then. After he left, Mrs. Whitman raised an eyebrow at Elizabeth. Henry Tucker is quite a catch, Miss Lawson, one of the most respected ranchers in the county. Oh, it's not like that, Elizabeth hastened to explain. He merely helped me when I was in distress last night. He's being kind, nothing more, Mrs. Whitman gave her a knowing look, but said nothing further on the subject. The afternoon passed quickly as Elizabeth learned the mercantile systems. By closing time, she felt she had made a good impression, and Mrs. Whitman confirmed as much. You've been a great help today, the older woman said as they prepared to close. You have a good head for figures and organization. I think this arrangement will work out fine. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Elizabeth replied sincerely. As promised, Henry arrived promptly at 6. He had changed into cleaner clothes, a crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. His hair, a rich brown with hints of gold where the sun had lightened it, was neatly combed, though a stubborn lock fell across his forehead. Ready for supper? He asked, offering his arm. Elizabeth nodded, suddenly self-conscious in her borrowed dress. I'm afraid I'm not properly attired for the hotel restaurant. Nonsense, Henry assured her. You look lovely. The Driscoll Hotel was the finest establishment in Austin, a testament to the city's growing prosperity. The restaurant within was elegant without being ostentatious, with white tablecloths and polished silverware. Elizabeth felt the stares of other diners as Henry led her to a table, and she knew that gossip about her failed marriage must already be circulating. People are watching us, she whispered as they were seated. Henry shrugged unconcernedly. Let them. You've done nothing wrong. The waiter brought menus and Henry recommended the steak. Best in town, he said with a smile. As they ate, Henry told Elizabeth about his ranch, the Triple T, located about 20 miles north of Austin. It's not the biggest spread, he explained, but the land is good and I've built up a decent herd over the past 5 years. Do you live there alone? Elizabeth asked, then blushed at the personal nature of the question. Henry didn't seem to mind. I've got a few hands who work for me year-round and I hire more during roundup season. But if you're asking if I have family there, the answer's no. My parents died when I was young and my older brother was killed during the war. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said softly. I know what it's like to lose family. My mother died when I was 12 and my father passed away shortly after that. I grew up in the St. Mary's orphanage until I was 18. And then you became a teacher, Elizabeth nodded. I was fortunate that the headmistress saw potential in me and arranged for me to receive proper education. Teaching was a way to repay that kindness, to help other children as I had been helped. You miss it, Henry observed. Very much, Elizabeth admitted, but the school year is almost over. Perhaps in the fall, there might be a position available. Their conversation flowed easily throughout the meal. Henry was an attentive listener, asking questions about her life and experiences without prying too deeply into painful subjects. In turn, he shared stories of ranch life, the challenges and rewards of working the land, the cattle drives, the changing seasons. "What brought you to Austin today?" Elizabeth asked as they shared a slice of apple pie for dessert. "Business, mainly," Henry replied. "Banking, supplies, checking cattle prices. I try to come into town once a month or so to take care of matters that can't be handled by letter." As they finished their meal, Elizabeth noticed a commotion near the entrance of the restaurant. Looking up, she froze. Harold Townsend had just entered with his parents. They had not yet seen her, but it was only a matter of time in the small dining room. "What's wrong?" Henry asked, noting her sudden pallor. "The Townsends just walked in," Elizabeth whispered, her appetite vanishing instantly. Henry glanced over his shoulder, his expression hardening. "Would you like to leave?" Before Elizabeth could answer, Mrs. Townsend spotted her. The older woman's face contorted with disdain, and she nudged her husband, pointing in Elizabeth's direction. Mr. Townsend's expression darkened, and he steered his wife and son toward Elizabeth's table. "Miss Lawson," Mr. Townsend said coldly, emphasizing her unmarried status, "I see you've wasted no time in finding yourself another provider. Your moral character continues to disappoint." Elizabeth felt as though she had been slapped. Before she could respond, Henry stood up, his height and broad shoulders suddenly imposing. "Mr. Townsend," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel, "I suggest you reconsider your words and tone when addressing Miss Lawson." "And who might you be, sir?" Mr. Townsend demanded. "Henry Tucker, owner of the Triple T Ranch." Henry's gaze shifted to Harold, who stood slightly behind his parents, looking uncomfortable. "And you must be Harold Townsend, the man who allowed his wife to be thrown onto the street on her wedding night." Harold flushed, unable to meet Henry's eyes. "It wasn't my decision," he mumbled. "A husband makes his own decisions," Henry replied firmly. "A man stands by his wife, protects her, honors her." "You failed in the most fundamental duty of a husband." "How dare you?" Mrs. Townsend interjected. "My son comes from one of the finest families in Austin. He deserves a wife of proper breeding and connections, not some orphan girl with nothing to her name." Elizabeth felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She would not give the Townsends the satisfaction of seeing her cry again. "I believe," Henry said, his voice still measured but cold as ice, "that the only people without proper breeding in this establishment are those who would mistreat a woman and then have the audacity to insult her in public." The restaurant had fallen silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Mr. Townsend's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You'll regret making an enemy of me, Tucker. I have considerable influence in this town." "And I have considerable influence in this county, Mr. Townsend," Henry replied evenly. "My cattle feed half the families in Austin, and my business supports dozens more. But more importantly, I have the influence of a clear conscience, something you seem to lack." Mr. Townsend sputtered in outrage, but his wife placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Come, Richard. This establishment has clearly lowered its standards in recent years. We'll dine elsewhere." With a final glare at Elizabeth, the Townsends turned and left, practically dragging Harold with them. The young man glanced back once, his expression a mixture of regret and uncertainty, but he made no move to break free from his parents' grip. As the door closed behind them, the restaurant gradually resumed its normal buzz of conversation, though many glances were still directed toward Elizabeth and Henry. Henry sat back down, his expression softening as he looked at Elizabeth. "I apologize if I overstepped. It wasn't my place to speak for you." "No," Elizabeth said, finding her voice at last. "Thank you for defending me. No one has done that before." Henry signaled for the bill. Would you like to leave? We can take a walk by the river if you'd prefer some fresh air." Elizabeth nodded gratefully. "Yes, please." The Colorado River, which ran along the southern edge of Austin, was peaceful in the early evening light. Henry and Elizabeth walked along its banks, the tension of the restaurant encounter gradually easing from their shoulders. "I've made my decision," Elizabeth said after they had walked in companionable silence for some time. "About the annulment, I won't contest it." Henry glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Are you certain?" Elizabeth nodded firmly. "What happened tonight confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Harold may have said vows to me, but he belongs to his parents. He'll never be his own man, let alone a proper husband." She sighed, watching the ripples on the water. "I wanted so badly to have a family of my own, to belong somewhere, that I ignored the signs that should have been clear from the beginning." "What signs?" Henry asked gently. "Harold never stood up to his parents, not once in all the time we courted. He would make plans with me, then cancel them if his mother disapproved. He proposed to me in secret, and we planned the wedding when his parents were away on business in New Orleans." Elizabeth shook her head at her own naivety. "I thought once we were married, things would be different. That he would finally put me first." "Some men never learn to cut those apron strings," Henry observed, "but their loss is often another man's gain." Elizabeth glanced at him, uncertain of his meaning, but Henry had turned to look out over the river, his profile strong against the darkening sky. "What will you do now?" he asked after a moment. "Besides working at the Mercantile, I mean." "Find a place to live, save my money, perhaps apply for a teaching position in the fall," Elizabeth replied. "Build a life for myself on my terms this time." Henry nodded approvingly. "That's a sound plan. But if you'll permit a suggestion, don't close yourself off to possibilities just because one man proved unworthy." Elizabeth felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening. "I'll try to remember that, Mr. Tucker." "Henry," he corrected with a smile. "After defending your honor in public, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you?" "Henry," she agreed, returning his smile. "And you must call me Elizabeth." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Elizabeth felt a curious lightness. Her heart still ached from betrayal, but beneath that pain was a sense of freedom she hadn't expected. One door had closed, but perhaps others would open doors she hadn't even known existed. The following weeks established a routine for Elizabeth. She worked diligently at the Mercantile, gradually earning Mrs. Whitman's complete trust and taking on more responsibilities. The initial stares and whispers that followed her through town diminished as newer gossip replaced the scandal of her failed marriage. The annulment was granted without contest, and Elizabeth Lawson remained her legal name, as if the brief ceremony with Harold had never happened. Henry Tucker came to town every few days, always finding time to visit Elizabeth at the Mercantile or take her to supper. Their friendship deepened with each encounter, and Elizabeth found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both pleased and frightened her. She wasn't ready for another romantic entanglement, not so soon after her heartbreak, but she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her whenever Henry appeared. One afternoon in late May, Henry arrived at the Mercantile just before closing time, his expression more serious than usual. "Elizabeth," he said after greeting Mrs. Whitman, "I was wondering if you might join me for a ride tomorrow. There's something I'd like to show you." "A ride?" Elizabeth questioned. "Where to?" "My ranch," Henry replied. "It's about an hour and a half by buggy. We could leave after church, take a picnic lunch." The invitation surprised her. They had never ventured beyond the confines of Austin together. "I'd like that," she found herself saying. The next day dawned clear and beautiful. After church services, Henry met Elizabeth outside the boarding house with a smart buggy pulled by two well-groomed bay horses. He had packed a picnic basket and a blanket, and he helped Elizabeth into the buggy with a gentle hand. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling hills covered in spring wildflowers, stands of oak and pecan trees, and occasional glimpses of the Colorado River winding its way through the countryside. Henry pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling stories of the area's history and his experiences since purchasing the ranch. "My brother and I always dreamed of having our own spread," he explained as they drove. "After he died at Gettysburg, I decided to honor that dream for both of us. Took every penny I had saved working as a trail boss and bought the land. It wasn't much at first, just a small cabin and 100 acres, but I've added to it year by year." "It's beautiful country," Elizabeth said, admiring the landscape. "Peaceful. It can be," Henry agreed. "Though ranching has its share of excitement too: stampedes, rustlers, the occasional ornery bull." They crested a hill, and Henry pulled the buggy to a stop. "There it is," he said with quiet pride. "The Triple T." Below them stretched a verdant valley. A neat white-painted ranch house stood in the center, surrounded by corrals, a barn, and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and horses moved about in one of the closer paddocks. A stream ran through the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. "It's wonderful," Elizabeth breathed, genuinely impressed. The ranch was clearly prosperous and well-maintained. Henry smiled at her enthusiasm. "Let me show you around." They continued down the hill, crossing a wooden bridge over the stream before pulling up in front of the ranch house. A middle-aged woman emerged from the house as they arrived, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Alvarez," Henry called in greeting. "I've brought a visitor. This is Miss Elizabeth Lawson. Elizabeth, this is Mrs. Alvarez, who keeps the house in order and makes sure I don't starve when I'm here." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Lawson," Mrs. Alvarez said with a warm smile. "Mr. Tucker has spoken of you often." "Has he?" Elizabeth glanced at Henry, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Only good things," Mrs. Alvarez assured her with a wink. "Will you be staying for supper?" "If that's not too much trouble," Henry replied. "But first, I'd like to show Elizabeth around the property." Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "I'll have something ready by 6. Henry gave Elizabeth a tour of the ranch, the barns filled with the sweet smell of hay, the corrals where several cowboys were working with horses, the garden behind the house that provided fresh vegetables for the table. Everywhere they went, the ranch hands greeted Henry with respect and obvious affection, tipping their hats to Elizabeth with shy courtesy. "They all seem to admire you greatly," Elizabeth observed as they walked toward the stream with their picnic basket. Henry shrugged modestly. "I try to be fair. Pay them well, treat them with respect. Most have been with me for years now." They spread the blanket beneath a large cottonwood tree by the stream. The picnic Mrs. Alvarez had packed was simple but delicious: fried chicken, biscuits, pickled vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. They ate companionably, watching the play of sunlight on the water. "Why did you bring me here today, Henry?" Elizabeth asked as they finished their meal. There was something in his manner, a contained energy, a sense of purpose that suggested this was more than a casual outing. Henry was silent for a moment, his gaze on the distant hills. "I wanted you to see where and how I live," he finally said, "to know me better." "I feel I know you quite well already," Elizabeth replied. "These past weeks you've been a true friend to me. Is that all I am to you, Elizabeth?" "A friend?" His eyes met hers, intense and questioning. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken. "Henry, I know it's too soon," he interrupted gently. "You've been through a terrible ordeal and your heart is still healing. I don't expect anything from you now. but I wanted you to know that my feelings for you have grown beyond friendship." Elizabeth was stunned by his candor. "We've only known each other for a short time," she said softly. "Sometimes a short time is all it takes to know what's right," Henry replied. "I'm not asking for promises, Elizabeth. Just the chance to court you properly when you're ready." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. Unlike Harold, whose words had often seemed practiced and whose promises had proven empty, Henry spoke plainly, honestly. There was no artifice in him, no hidden agenda. "I care for you too, Henry," she admitted. "More than I expected to, especially after what happened, but I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of trusting again, of being hurt again." She looked down at her hands. "Of not being enough." Henry reached across the blanket, taking her hand in his. "Elizabeth, look at me." When she did, he continued, "You are more than enough. You're strong, intelligent, kind, and beautiful. Any man would be fortunate to have you by his side." Tears pricked at Elizabeth's eyes. "The Townsends didn't think so." "The Townsends are fools," Henry stated firmly. "They valued the wrong things: money, status, connections. Those things don't make a marriage or a life. Character does, heart does, and you have both in abundance." A tear slipped down Elizabeth's cheek, and Henry reached out to brush it away, his touch gentle against her skin. "I won't rush you," he promised. "Take all the time you need, I'll be here." The moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats. One of the ranch hands was riding toward them at a gallop. "Mr. Tucker," he called as he approached. "There's trouble at the north pasture. The creek's overflowed its banks and some of the cattle are stranded." Henry was on his feet immediately, his expression changing from tender to alert. "I need to handle this," he told Elizabeth. "Will you be all right waiting at the house with Mrs. Alvarez?" "Of course," Elizabeth assured him. "Go." Henry squeezed her hand once, then hurried to meet the cowboy, already issuing instructions as they moved toward the barn. Elizabeth gathered up the picnic things and made her way back to the ranch house, where Mrs. Alvarez welcomed her warmly. "Mr. Tucker had to see to an emergency," Elizabeth explained. Mrs. Alvarez nodded understandingly. "That's ranching life, Miss Lawson. Never a dull moment. Come in and have some coffee while we wait." The ranch house was as impressive inside as out, spacious but comfortable, with solid furniture and tasteful decorations. Mrs. Alvarez showed Elizabeth to the parlor, then brought coffee and freshly baked cookies. "This is a lovely home," Elizabeth commented, admiring the room. "Mr. Tucker has worked hard to make it so," Mrs. Alvarez replied. "He's built most of the furniture himself, has quite a talent for woodworking." Elizabeth was surprised. "I didn't know that about him." Mrs. Alvarez smiled. "There's much to know about Henry Tucker. He's a good man, the best I've known since my Manuel passed away 5 years ago. Works harder than any 3 men, fair to everyone, generous to those in need." "You're very fond of him," Elizabeth observed. "Like a son to me," Mrs. Alvarez confirmed. "My own boys work cattle for him, Miguel and Francisco. They speak highly of him, too." She studied Elizabeth over her coffee cup. "He's never brought a lady to the ranch before. You must be special to him." Elizabeth felt a blush warm her cheeks. "We're friends. He's been very kind to me during a difficult time." Mrs. Alvarez's knowing smile suggested she wasn't convinced by Elizabeth's modest assessment, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she showed Elizabeth around the rest of the house, including the library filled with books on a variety of subjects, evidence of Henry's curious and educated mind. It was nearly sunset when Henry returned, his clothes mud-splattered but his expression satisfied. "All the cattle are safe," he reported. "The creek's already receding, so there shouldn't be any more problems." "That's good news," Mrs. Alvarez said. "Supper's ready whenever you are, once you've cleaned up." Henry excused himself to change, returning shortly in fresh clothes. The three of them enjoyed a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple cobbler for dessert. Henry and Mrs. Alvarez entertained Elizabeth with stories of ranch life, including tales of the annual cattle drive to Kansas. "Will you be going on the drive this year?" Elizabeth asked. Henry nodded. "I always do. We leave in a few weeks and usually return by late August. It's hard work, but there's nothing quite like it: the open sky, the rhythm of the trail, the satisfaction of delivering a healthy herd to market." Elizabeth tried to imagine the life months on the trail, sleeping under the stars, facing whatever challenges nature and circumstance might present. It was so different from the structured, contained existence she had known as a teacher and shopkeeper. After supper, with darkness having fallen, Henry suggested they should start back to Austin. "I don't want Mrs. Patterson to worry," he explained as he helped Elizabeth into the buggy. The ride back was quieter, both of them reflective after the day's events. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the velvet sky, and a nearly full moon illuminated the road. "Thank you for today," Elizabeth said as they neared Austin, "for showing me your home, for being honest about your feelings." "Thank you for coming," Henry replied, "and for listening." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said, Elizabeth. I won't rush you, but I also won't hide how I feel. Life's too short for that kind of pretense." Elizabeth knew he was thinking of his brother, of all the dreams cut short by war and circumstance. "When do you leave for the cattle drive?" she asked. "2 weeks from Tuesday," Henry answered. "We'll be driving the herd to Dodge City this year. Should take about 3 months round trip." "3 months is a long time," Elizabeth murmured. Henry glanced at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Long enough to give you the time you need to think, perhaps?" Elizabeth couldn't help but smile back. "Perhaps." When they reached the boarding house, Henry helped Elizabeth down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Elizabeth," he said softly. "Good night, Henry," she replied, her heart beating a little faster at his proximity. He watched until she was safely inside before climbing back into the buggy and driving away. Elizabeth stood at the window of her room, watching his departure, her mind and heart full of conflicting emotions. The day had changed something between them, shifted their relationship in a way that could not be undone. The question now was what path they would follow from this new beginning. The 2 weeks before Henry's departure passed quickly. He came to town several times, taking Elizabeth to dinner, for walks along the river, or simply visiting her at the mercantile. They did not speak again of his declaration by the stream, but it hung in the air between them, coloring their interactions with a new awareness. The evening before he was to leave for the cattle drive, Henry invited Elizabeth to dinner at the Driscoll Hotel once more. She had saved enough from her wages to purchase a new dress for the occasion, a modest but becoming gown of deep blue that complemented her fair coloring. "You look beautiful," Henry said when he called for her, his admiration evident in his eyes. "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, pleased by his reaction. "This is a special occasion after all. I wanted to look my best." The restaurant was busy, but Henry had reserved a quiet table in the corner. After they had ordered, he presented Elizabeth with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Just a small gift to remember me by while I'm away," Henry explained. Elizabeth carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, exquisitely carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. "I made it," Henry said, a hint of shyness in his voice. "Mrs. Alvarez mentioned she'd told you about my woodworking. I thought you might like something to keep your small treasures in." "You made this?" Elizabeth was amazed by the craftsmanship. "It's wonderful, Henry, thank you. Open it," he urged. Elizabeth lifted the lid to find a small book inside a collection of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. "How did you know I love poetry?" she asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I saw you reading a volume of Tennyson at the boarding house one evening," Henry admitted. "Thought you might enjoy Mrs. Browning as well." The care he had taken to notice her interests and preferences warmed Elizabeth's heart. Harold had never paid such attention to the details of her life, never made such an effort to please her in ways that were meaningful rather than merely showy. "I'll treasure both these gifts," she said sincerely, "and I'll think of you often while you're away." Henry's smile was tender. "I hoped you might." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Elizabeth, I know I promised not to rush you, and I mean to keep that promise. But before I leave tomorrow, I need to know if there's hope for us. When I return in the fall, might you be ready to consider a future together?" Elizabeth looked into his earnest face, feeling the steady strength of his hand holding hers. Over the past weeks, she had come to know Henry as a man of integrity, kindness, and quiet courage, everything Harold had pretended to be but wasn't. The fear that had gripped her heart since the night of her disastrous wedding had gradually loosened its hold, replaced by a growing affection for the man before her. "Yes, Henry," she said softly. "I believe I might." His face lit with joy, making him look younger and even more handsome. "That's all I needed to hear. I can face 3 months on the trail with that hope to sustain me." They lingered over dinner, reluctant for the evening to end. When they finally left the hotel, the streets of Austin were quiet, most businesses closed for the night. They walked slowly toward the boarding house, savoring these last moments together. At the door, Henry took both her hands in his. "I'll write when I can," he promised, "though letters from the trail are irregular at best." "I understand," Elizabeth assured him. "I'll be here when you return." Henry hesitated, then leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Elizabeth. Until fall." "Until fall," she echoed, watching as he walked away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. Summer in Austin was brutally hot, but Elizabeth found the heat less oppressive than the waiting. June stretched into July, and July into August, with no word from Henry. Mrs. Patterson assured her this was normal for men on cattle drives. Post offices were few and far between on the trail to Kansas. Elizabeth threw herself into her work at the Mercantile, earning a raise from Mrs. Whitman in recognition of her diligence. She saved every penny beyond her basic expenses, dreaming of the day when she might have a home of her own again. In the evenings, she read from the book of poetry Henry had given her, finding solace and beauty in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's words. One particularly hot afternoon in late August, Mrs. Whitman approached Elizabeth as she was arranging a new display of fabrics. "Elizabeth, dear, I've just received word that there will be an opening for a teacher at the school this fall. Mrs. Henderson is expecting a child and won't be returning. I thought you might be interested." Elizabeth's heart leapt at the news. Teaching had been her passion, and while she had grown to enjoy her work at the Mercantile, the classroom called to her. "Yes, I would be very interested. Thank you for letting me know." "I'd be sorry to lose you," Mrs. Whitman admitted, "but I know how much teaching means to you. The school board is meeting tomorrow evening to discuss candidates. I've taken the liberty of recommending you." "That's very kind of you," Elizabeth said gratefully. "Not at all. You're an excellent teacher by all accounts. The children would benefit from your instruction." The next day, Elizabeth received a formal invitation to meet with the school board. She dressed carefully in her best clothes and prepared to answer their questions about her qualifications and teaching philosophy. The meeting was held in the town hall, with the 5 members of the school board seated at a long table. Among them, to Elizabeth's dismay, was Richard Townsend. As one of the wealthiest men in Austin, he naturally held positions of influence throughout the community. Mr. Townsend's expression darkened when Elizabeth entered the room, but he said nothing as the chairman, Mr. Collins, welcomed her and began the interview. Elizabeth answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on her previous teaching experience and her genuine love for education. The interview seemed to be going well until Mr. Townsend finally spoke. "Miss Lawson, I must raise a concern about your moral character and suitability as a role model for impressionable young minds." The other board members looked at him in surprise. "What concern might that be, Mr. Townsend?" Mr. Collins asked. "Miss Lawson was recently involved in a scandalous situation," Mr. Townsend stated coldly. "A failed marriage to my son, followed by immediate association with another man, highly improper behavior for a young woman, let alone a teacher." Elizabeth felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. "Mr. Townsend, that is a gross mischaracterization of events," she protested, struggling to maintain her composure. "Is it?" Mr. Townsend challenged. "You were seen dining alone with Henry Tucker the very day after your marriage to my son was annulled. What conclusions should the good people of Austin draw from such behavior?" The other board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Elizabeth and Mr. Townsend. It was clear that this was the first they had heard of these allegations. "I believe," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil, "that the good people of Austin should draw conclusions based on truth rather than malicious gossip. The truth is that your son married me knowing his parents disapproved. When you returned unexpectedly from your trip, you forced him to choose between his wife and his inheritance. He chose the latter, and I was thrown out onto the street with nowhere to go. Mr. Tucker showed me Christian charity when I most needed it, nothing more." Mrs. Baker, the only female member of the board, frowned at Mr. Townsend. "Is this true, Richard? You threw this young woman out of your home on her wedding night." Mr. Townsend's face flushed. "The marriage was a mistake, entered into without proper consideration. My son realized his error and sought an annulment, as was his right. After you threatened to disinherit him," Elizabeth added quietly. "This is hardly relevant to the position at hand," Mr. Townsend blustered. "The fact remains that Miss Lawson's reputation has been compromised. Parents would object to having their children taught by a woman of questionable virtue." "I see nothing questionable about surviving adversity with dignity," Mrs. Baker countered. "If anything, Miss Lawson has demonstrated remarkable resilience and strength of character qualities we should want our children to emulate." The chairman cleared his throat. "I believe we have sufficient information to make our decision. Thank you, Miss Lawson, for your time. We will inform you of our decision by the end of the week." Elizabeth left the town hall with a heavy heart, certain that Mr. Townsend's influence would deny her the teaching position she so desperately wanted. She walked slowly back to the boarding house, fighting tears of frustration and anger. To her surprise, Mrs. Patterson was waiting for her with an envelope. "This came for you today," she said, handing it to Elizabeth. "From the north, by the postmark." Elizabeth recognized Henry's handwriting immediately and hurried to her room to read the letter in private. It was dated nearly a month earlier, explaining the delay in its arrival. "Dearest Elizabeth," Henry had written, "we have reached Dodge City with the herd intact, despite some challenges along the trail. A lightning storm spooked the cattle early in the drive, causing a stampede that took us 2 days to recover from. Later, we faced a flooded river crossing that delayed us nearly a week. But such is the life of a cattleman, and these obstacles only make the successful completion of the drive more satisfying. I think of you constantly, especially in the quiet hours of night watch, when the stars seem to speak of possibilities and promises. I carry the memory of your smile with me, a light to guide me home when this journey is done. The cattle have fetched a good price, better than I hoped for. This means I can make some improvements to the ranch that I've been planning for some time. Perhaps when I return, you might advise me on these changes. Your taste and judgment would be most welcome. We begin the journey home tomorrow. With fair weather and good fortune, I should return to Austin by the end of August or early September. Until then, know that my thoughts and heart are with you. Yours, Henry. Elizabeth pressed the letter to her chest, tears of a different sort now flowing freely. The simple, honest words were a balm to her wounded spirit after the confrontation with Mr. Townsend. Whatever happened with the teaching position, she was not alone. Someone cared for her, valued her, saw her worth beyond the cruel judgments of others. 3 days later, Elizabeth received a letter from the school board. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. "Dear Miss Lawson," it read, "we are pleased to offer you the position of teacher for the intermediate class at Austin Grammar School, commencing on September 15th. Elizabeth could scarcely believe it. Despite Mr. Townsend's objections, the board had chosen her. The letter continued to explain that the decision had been made by majority vote, with Mrs. Baker in particular speaking strongly in her favor. That same afternoon, as Elizabeth was sharing her good news with Mrs. Whitman, the bell above the mercantile door jingled. She looked up to see Henry Tucker standing there, his skin tanned darker from months under the open sky, his frame leaner from the hard work of the trail, but his smile as warm as ever. "Henry," she exclaimed, joy bubbling up inside her, "you're back." "Just rode in this morning," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "Couldn't wait to see you." Mrs. Whitman discreetly moved to the back of the store, giving them a moment of privacy. "I got your letter," Elizabeth told him, "just yesterday." "Only one made it through then," Henry said with a rueful smile. "I sent 3. It was enough," Elizabeth assured him. "And I have news as well. I've been offered a teaching position at the school for the fall term." Henry's face lit with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful. I know how much teaching means to you." "It wasn't certain," Elizabeth admitted, then briefly explained about Mr. Townsend's intervention. "But the board voted to hire me anyway." A shadow crossed Henry's face at the mention of Townsend. "That man seems determined to cause you pain." "He failed this time," Elizabeth said with quiet satisfaction, "and I won't let him interfere with my happiness again." Henry's expression softened. "Does that mean you've made some decisions while I was away?" Elizabeth nodded, suddenly shy despite the certainty in her heart. "I have." "Would you share them with me? Perhaps over dinner tonight?" "I'd like that very much." That evening they dined again at the Driscoll, but afterward, instead of returning directly to the boarding house, Henry suggested a walk by the river. The night was cooler than it had been in weeks, a hint of autumn in the air despite it being only late August. They found a bench overlooking the water, the moon casting a silver path across its surface. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the peace of the evening and the simple pleasure of being together again. "I missed you," Henry said at last, "more than I expected to." "I missed you too," Elizabeth replied softly. Henry turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Before I left, you said you might be ready to consider a future together when I returned. I've thought about little else these past months. I know it hasn't been long since we met, and you've had much to overcome. If you need more time, I understand. But I need you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger." Elizabeth looked into his earnest face, feeling a certainty she had never experienced before, not with Harold, not with any decision in her life. "I don't need more time, Henry. These months without you have made me realize how much you've come to mean to me. How different you are from Harold and his family. You see me for who I am, not for what I can bring you in terms of status or connections." "I see a remarkable woman," Henry said, his voice husky with emotion. "Strong, intelligent, kind-hearted. A woman any man would be proud to call his wife." He paused, then asked simply, "Elizabeth Lawson, will you marry me?" Elizabeth's heart soared at the words. There was no hesitation, no doubt in her mind or heart. "Yes, Henry, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face and he leaned forward, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Unlike her first kiss with Harold, which had left her uncertain and somehow wanting, this kiss felt like coming home safe, warm, full of promise. When they finally parted, Henry reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I've been carrying this since Dodge City," he explained, tipping a ring into his palm. "Wanted to be prepared just in case." The ring was simple but beautiful, a small diamond set in gold, with tiny flowers engraved on the band. "It's perfect," Elizabeth breathed as Henry slipped it onto her finger. "Like you," he murmured, kissing her again. They agreed to a short engagement, planning the wedding for early October, after Elizabeth had settled into her teaching position, and before the winter weather made travel difficult for guests coming from surrounding areas. Unlike her previous wedding, which had been a lavish affair funded by the Townsends, who had, ironically, objected most strenuously to the match they had financed, this would be a simple ceremony with only true friends in attendance. Mrs. Whitman insisted on hosting the wedding breakfast at her home, while Mrs. Patterson helped Elizabeth alter a lovely cream-colored dress for the occasion. Henry's ranch hands pitched in to prepare the triple tea for its new mistress, adding feminine touches to the house under Mrs. Alvarez's direction. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Austin. Most people responded with genuine good wishes, but the Townsends made their disapproval known, refusing to patronize businesses that associated with the couple. Their influence, however, was not as absolute as they had believed. Many in the community had grown weary of the family's haughty manner and were quietly pleased to see Elizabeth find happiness despite their attempts to ruin her reputation. On the morning of October 8, 1876, Elizabeth stood before the mirror in Mrs. Whitman's guest bedroom, hardly recognizing the radiant woman who gazed back at her. The cream-colored dress, adorned with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, complemented her fair skin and golden hair, which was arranged in an elegant knot with a few soft curls framing her face. Mrs. Whitman entered the room, smiling at the sight. "You look beautiful, my dear." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "And thank you for everything you've done to make this day special." "It has been my pleasure," Mrs. Whitman assured her. "You deserve this happiness, Elizabeth. Henry is a good man." "The best," Elizabeth agreed softly. A knock at the door heralded the arrival of Mrs. Patterson. "It's time," she announced. "The Reverend is ready, and your groom is waiting, looking as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, I might add." Elizabeth laughed, her heart full of joy. This was so different from her first wedding day, when she had been filled with nervous uncertainty, despite her determination to believe in Harold's love. Today, she felt only certainty and peace, secure in the knowledge that Henry's love was true and steadfast. The ceremony was held in the town's small Methodist church, decorated simply with autumn flowers and greenery. As Elizabeth walked down the aisle alone, an orphan with no father to give her away, she saw only Henry, standing tall and handsome at the altar, his eyes never leaving her face. The Reverend's words were traditional but heartfelt as he spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the commitment the couple was making before God and community. When the time came for them to speak their vows, Elizabeth's voice was clear and unwavering. This time, she knew with absolute certainty that the promises she made would be honored by both herself and her husband. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared at last. "Mr. Tucker, you may kiss your bride." Henry's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a pledge of the life they would build together. As they turned to face their friends, now officially introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Henry Tucker, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of rightness, as if everything in her life had been leading to this moment. The wedding breakfast at Mrs. Whitman's home was a joyous affair, with delicious food, laughter, and heartfelt toasts to the couple's happiness. Mrs. Alvarez had traveled from the ranch to attend, bringing with her Henry's ranch hands, all dressed in their Sunday best and awkwardly, but sincerely offering their congratulations to their boss's new wife. As the celebration continued, Elizabeth slipped away to the garden for a moment of quiet reflection. So much had changed in the 6 months since that rainy night when Henry had found her crying in the streets of Austin. From the depths of despair, she had found her way to a joy deeper and more authentic than anything she had known before. "There you are," Henry's voice interrupted her thoughts as he joined her in the garden. "Everything all right?" Elizabeth smiled up at her husband, in truth and in heart this time. "Everything is perfect. I was just thinking about how much has changed since we met." Henry wrapped his arms around her waist, drawing her close. "For the better, I hope." "Infinitely better," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "I never imagined that night when you found me that such happiness could come from such sorrow." "Sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest futures," Henry observed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "If not for the Townsends' cruelty, we might never have met." "Then I suppose I should be grateful to them," Elizabeth said with a small laugh. "Let's not go that far," Henry replied, his tone light but with an undercurrent of seriousness. "But I am grateful for every circumstance that brought you into my life, Elizabeth Tucker." The name, her new name, sent a thrill through Elizabeth's heart. This time it was freely chosen, a symbol of a true union rather than a facade. They returned to the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from their friends. As the afternoon wore on, they prepared to depart for the ranch, their home now. Henry had arranged for a new buggy, decorated with flowers and ribbons for the occasion, to transport them in style. As they were saying their goodbyes, a commotion at the front of the house drew their attention. Harold Townsend stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable and out of place. A hush fell over the gathering as he approached Elizabeth and Henry. I wanted to offer my congratulations," he said awkwardly, "and to apologize, Elizabeth, for my behavior, for not standing up for you when I should have." Elizabeth was speechless, but Henry responded with quiet dignity. "That's a manly thing to do, Townsend. We appreciate it." Harold nodded, his expression pained. "My parents don't know I'm here. They'd be furious if they did, but I couldn't let you leave without saying something." He looked directly at Elizabeth. "I'm sorry I wasn't the man you deserved. I'm glad you found someone who is." "Thank you, Harold," Elizabeth said softly, finding her voice at last. "I hope you find happiness as well." Harold gave a sad smile. "Perhaps someday. Goodbye, Elizabeth, Mr. Tucker." He turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived. The guests began to murmur among themselves, but Henry simply took Elizabeth's hand. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Tucker?" The word home filled Elizabeth with warmth. "Yes, I am." The journey to the Triple T was filled with conversation and comfortable silences, both of them content in each other's company. As they approached the ranch, Elizabeth was surprised to see smoke rising from several bonfires around the property, and lanterns hanging from trees leading to the house. "What's all this?" she asked, gesturing to the unusual decorations. Henry smiled mysteriously. "Just a small welcome." As they crossed the bridge over the stream, Elizabeth saw that all the ranch hands and their families had gathered in the yard. They cheered as the buggy approached, calling out congratulations and good wishes. "They wanted to celebrate with us," Henry explained, clearly pleased by his workers' enthusiasm. "Mrs. Alvarez organized it before she left for Austin this morning." The impromptu celebration continued into the evening, with music provided by several ranch hands who played fiddles and guitars. There was dancing and laughter under the stars, a perfect end to a perfect day. As night fell and the festivities began to wind down, Henry led Elizabeth into their home, a phrase she couldn't stop repeating to herself with wonder and joy. He had made several improvements since her last visit, including new curtains in the parlor and a beautiful quilt on the bed in the master bedroom, which Mrs. Alvarez had helped him select. "What do you think?" he asked as they stood in the center of the bedroom. "Is there anything you'd like to change?" Elizabeth shook her head, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness he had shown in preparing the house for her arrival. "It's perfect, Henry, all of it." He drew her into his arms, his expression tender. "Welcome home, Mrs. Tucker." "Home," Elizabeth repeated, the word containing all her hopes and dreams for their future together. At last. The following years brought changes and challenges, but through it all, Elizabeth and Henry's love remained steadfast. Elizabeth continued teaching for a year before the birth of their first child, a son they named James, after Henry's father. She later returned to education, establishing a small school on the ranch for the children of the workers and neighboring farms. Henry's business prospered, allowing them to expand the ranch and improve the living conditions for their employees. They became known throughout the county for their fairness, generosity, and community spirit. The Townsends eventually left Austin, moving to New York after a series of poor investments diminished their fortune and influence. Harold wrote occasionally, having found some measure of independence in their absence. He married a shopkeeper's daughter, a choice his parents would never have approved, and seemed content with his simpler life. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Henry presented Elizabeth with a special gift, a new house, larger than the original ranch house, but just as warm and welcoming, with a spacious library and classroom for her teaching, a nursery for James and the daughter who had joined their family the previous year, and plenty of room for the family they hoped would continue to grow. "It seems like a dream sometimes," Elizabeth remarked as they sat on the porch of their new home that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. James played with wooden blocks at their feet, while baby Margaret slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "What does?" Henry asked, his arm around her shoulders. "All of this. That night in the rain seems both yesterday and a lifetime ago." She turned to look at him, love filling her heart. "I never imagined then that being thrown out by the Townsends would lead to such happiness." Henry pressed a kiss to her temple. "Their loss was my gain, the greatest gain of my life." Elizabeth leaned against his solid strength, content in the knowledge that this was where she truly belonged. Not in the Townsend mansion with its cold grandeur, but here on the Triple T, with a man who loved her for exactly who she was, surrounded by the family they had created together. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Elizabeth offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the storm that had led her to this harbor, for the sorrow that had opened the door to joy, and for the love that had transformed her life from that fateful night, when a cowboy had found her crying in the rain and taken her in.